Let's talk about true life and where these memoirs belong, both in the context of your own work as well as the literary pantheon.
Well, I believe the book that I'm going to start now is going to be my 36th or 37th book off the top of my head. I can't recall. So this is the end of 2015, so it's almost 12 full calendar years that I've been writing. And True Life were the first four prose books that I did, which was transitioning from poetry over into prose. Because I stopped writing poetry in, I think, the spring of 2005, simply because I'd gotten to a point where it wasn't even challenging anymore. And I, I've said this before, and I know people make it seem arrogant, but when you get to that point, you become almost godlike and can do anything within an art form. You have to find something else, and so I did the memoirs because it blended poetry and prose in the way Dante did La Vita Nuova, although it's far beyond what Dante could do. Not just in terms of Dante was just mixing some pretty bad poems with mediocre poems at best, with some prose observations that were not his best. Although overall it works very well at its best, and it's an interesting amalgam. The four books that comprise the True Life were written all separately, but all four in a row over about a 9 month period from January to, I believe, September, and then I edited it for a month or so. And they consist of memoirs, mostly with a few standalone poems, and that's the language in that is very compressed. It's more rat-a-tat-tat. It's more Hemingway-esque in that sense, although it's nothing like Hemingway. It's just a lot of short observations, unlike in the Vincetti brothers or Norwegian, where I'm really just uh, full out prose mastery in terms of of the construction of the sentences and paragraphs. Here, it was more or less a very poetic kind of prose style uh, that suited my aims at the time, and they basically recount what happened to me. The first I wrote it. I wrote them when I was 38, and they basically are. They correspond to each of the first 4 decades of my life, with slight variations, um, and they move backward and forward in time. And it's something that I still think there's nothing like them, and the mix of prose and poetry in its own way is probably going to be a long time if anyone equals or surpasses that. But uh, it's totally different than some of the other things that came later. Um, uh, of course, I did two other memoirs later, one on a mixture of essays with memoirs balanced on political subjects, and then a memoir of my 14 years working at a mob front. And I didn't include some of that stuff simply because at the time I wasn't ready to write about that. Um, and I guess True Life, uh, I didn't. I have to say though, I didn't. I enjoyed it in one sense, and another sense, I didn't enjoy it because with memoirs, you have to change everyone's names. So in a sense, they become fiction because if I say that Alex Sheremet and I are skyping, that's a truthful comment on the reality. If I say Billy Bob Joe Thornton and Dan Schneider are skyping, you're not Billy Bob Joe Thornton, so that's actually a lie. So that's a fiction. And so that's the title. In fact, the True Life plays with that because I have to condense things. I have to change all the names, sometimes change the places because some of these things involved things that I saw or did as a kid that were not legal. And, I can't name some of the corrupt politicians or corrupt cops that I knew for fear of being sued because we don't live in a society that basically allows for people to tell things that they know to be true. And so it plays with that's one of the major themes of that book is what is true and what is not, and how can one deal with that? But it is a pain in the ass, and I don't know. Right now, I have no plans of writing any further memoirs because uh, I don't know. It's just too much of a hassle because you try to remember everything as correctly as possible, but you always run into the he said she said thing, and that's why you have to change the names. And it's sometimes better to just go the fictional route, the full force fictional route. Um, but I again, it was important because it was the sort of the dime that or the access point that got me from poetry to doing the prose. Uh, and sometime in the future, I'll probably go from just do. I'll probably get bored with novels in 5 or 10 years, maybe, and then maybe I'll start writing plays. And then maybe when I'm a bit older and I don't have the time or the energy to do longer stuff, maybe I'll go back to poetry then. And it would be interesting to see how the 12 years I was a great poet from the age of basically 28 to 40, if I, let's say at the age of 70 or 75, if I'm still alive, I take up poetry again, how in that 30-year period interim, how quickly I can pick up, or if I can pick up the poetry again. Uh, but anyway, so that's where true life stands in my works.
Are you ever going to revisit the character of the dude from True Life? Because as I remember, he was probably one of the most enigmatic, both within the realm of the memoir and that kind of semi-fictive universe, as well as whatever real-world analog he might have. So, are you ever going to revisit him or characters related to him in that way?
Um, I may. I will probably have the character, the dude. The dude was based upon this guy who actually lived just, let me see, one, two, two buildings down from me when I lived in Glendale. He was this Italian fellow. I can't remember his real name. I only heard it maybe once or twice. But he was a character that looked a lot like the Michael Richards portrayal uh, of what the hell is the character from Seinfeld, Kramer.
Mm-hmm.
He had hair that was sort of bouffanted out. He always had a toothpick sticking out of one side or a cigarette out of his mouth, and he had this weird kind of shuffle. And for the longest time when I was a kid, well, actually, I had seen him. I remember when I was 5 or 6 years old and I first got my first eyeglasses. I remember my mom and I were coming out of the office of Mr. Nierengarten, who was the optometrist, down on somewhere far down on Underdunk Avenue, and one I think it was Himrod Street in Ridgewood. And I remember seeing this guy who I later became known as the dude to a lot of people, walking. And I remember him sort of like eyeballing me and whatnot. And I guess he was a fixture around the Ridgewood and Glendale neighborhoods. When I moved to Glendale, then I did see him again, and he was at first you just thought maybe he was a stoner or a drunk or something, and I forget the actual way. I mean, it was always rumored, I guess, that he was some kind of a cop or undercover cop, and I don't know whether he worked for the federal government or what law enforcement agency. I do remember a time when there was a shootout in Forest Park, and he was involved with the police there, and me and uh, uh, one of my friends from high school, well, not in high school, but Paco, had seen him there, and but anyway, he was one of these figures that it's sort of on the periphery of your life, and he's one of these kind of legendary figures, just like the character of John Doe, which is based on a real life politician who because as far as I know, he's still alive. I can't name, um, but he'll probably. I've had thoughts that I may have him just be peripherally make an appearance in my spy thriller book because it would make sense that there might be some little crossover, but he's not going to be a major character. There are some characters that simply run their course, and then there are other characters that are sort of renewable resources. The character, for example, of uh, the dwarf, Bit von Rheingold, who had his own book and then became, even though he's not the dominant character in terms of importance in the narrative in a Norwegian in the family, has the most face time, and he has a 900,000 word chapter where he's basically the star, and he's tripping through an acid trip through literary history. Um, he's a character that can be reused over and over again. The character of Paulie Maravelli, who is probably, like they say, patient zero. Paulie Maravelli is sort of character zero in the Schneider fictive universe. Everything in one way or another revolves around Paulie Maravelli. In the stories I did leading up to A Norwegian in the Family, people were always talking about him. He was seen in a couple of short stories. He's the central character of A Norwegian in the Family, and he will be mentioned here and there throughout. Other characters run their course. The other character that has probably run his course, and I probably will never have FaceTime again, except maybe in a cameo, just being seen walking somewhere, is Big Frank Concetto, who was a character that through the first 4 or 5 drafts of the Vincetti brothers, and he's the mobster that's the protege of Paulie Maravelli, who then takes over the Maravelli family. He's a character that the more I would tell, the less he would be effective. And so he's basically just going to be in the Vincetti Brothers, the one chapter that he basically has a lot of appearance, and also in A Norwegian in the Family. Same thing with the character of the Norwegian. He's a renewable resource, though, so he's definitely going to reappear in the spy book, although not in as prominent a role. But the dude is one of those characters that will probably make guest appearances. He may also appear. He probably will appear if I ever do a book. I'm probably thinking of doing a book on this pimp character that in my both in true life, because he was actually based on someone real, and I morphed him over into the fictive universe. The character of Sally Tranghese, who is a pimp. Uh, he'll probably appear in that book as well. But yeah, the dude will be back.